fine. I had no symptoms that I was aware of, but clearly he had noticed some, and he called 911. They didn't know I'd had a stroke, and I didn't know either.
There's a certain magic in Tim Curry's presence, a mix of charm, danger, and wit that made him unforgettable. From the eccentric brilliance of the Rocky Horror Picture Show to the haunting menace of It, he gave audiences characters that transcended the screen. But behind that legendary voice and captivating grin lies a story few expected, a sudden life-altering tragedy that changed everything. This is the untold story of Tim Curry's greatest battle. The stroke. In 2012. It's often said that Tim Curry could fill a room without saying a word. His voice alone carried the weight of entire worlds, velvet and venom in equal measure. Whether he was crooning a rock ballad in corset and pearls, or whispering dread as the clown Pennywise, Curry seemed eternal. That's what made what happened in 2012 so unthinkable. The moment when the man who had given life to so many voices suddenly struggled to find his own. In the years leading up to his stroke, Tim Curry had lived a quieter life than the flamboyant characters he once portrayed. He had stepped back from the relentless pace of Hollywood, spending much of his time at home in Los Angeles. But even in that relative calm, he remained active, attending small events, recording voice work, and charming anyone lucky enough to cross his path. Friends and fans often described him the same way: witty, sharp, and magnetic. There was no mistaking him, even from across a crowded room. He had the kind of charisma that doesn't fade, the kind that lingers in memory long after he's gone. But then came the day when everything stopped. In July 2012, Tim Curry suffered a massive stroke at his home. The details that reached the public were sparse, partly because those closest to him respected his privacy. Reports trickled out slowly, and when they did, they carried a quiet shock. The headlines were cautious: Tim Curry recovering after stroke. But the tone was clear. Something serious had happened to one of the most distinctive voices in entertainment. Paramedics arrived quickly, and Curry was rushed to a Los Angeles hospital. For days, the public heard nothing. Fans feared the worst. The silence was heavy, the kind that only deepens when it surrounds someone known for sound. When his spokesperson finally confirmed he was recovering, relief spread across social media and fan communities. But there was also uncertainty. What did recovering mean for a performer whose greatest instrument was his body and voice? The stroke left Curry with significant mobility challenges. He began using a wheelchair and faced the long, painful road of rehabilitation. For a man who once strutted across the stage in fishnets and heels, that change was profound. To the public, the shift felt almost unreal. How could someone so full of life, who embodied theatrical excess, who sang and danced with reckless abandon, now be confined to stillness? But those who knew him best said that while his movement changed, his spirit didn't. The humor was still there, the sharp wit, the playful sarcasm, the impeccable timing, all intact. It was as though the stroke had touched his body, but missed the essence of who he was. The aftermath. In the months that followed, Curry stayed out of sight. Unlike many celebrities who document their recovery journeys, he chose privacy. There were no hospital photos, no video updates. The quiet was deliberate, a way to heal without spectacle. Yet that very silence led to speculation. Online forums filled with worried fans, wondering if the worst had happened. Some tabloids even reported rumors of his death, untrue. but widely circulated. For fans who grew up quoting Rocky Horror, or who still flinched at the memory of his Pennywise grin, it was a chilling reminder of how fragile their icons could be. When Curry finally re-emerged months later, his presence alone was enough to still those rumors. Though seated in a wheelchair, he smiled warmly, cracked jokes, and looked directly into the cameras. He wasn't gone, just changed. For an artist, losing control of your body can feel like losing your identity. Acting, after all, is movement, gesture, tone, the physical translation of imagination. For Curry, whose entire career had been built on expressive range, the stroke was a cruel inversion. Yet, as one close friend noted, Tim never wallowed. He joked about it, that humor became both armor and medicine. He laughed at the absurdity of recovery exercises, teased his therapists, and found comfort in the company of friends who treated him not as a patient, but as Tim. To those who visited, the most striking thing wasn't what he'd lost, it was what remained. His intelligence, his warmth, his twinkle of mischief, all of it still burned brightly. There's something profoundly symbolic about the stroke of a man whose voice once commanded both fear and joy. In it, his Pennywise was a nightmare given words. In Clue, his Wadsworth orchestrated chaos with machine gun precision. And in Rocky Horror, he was pure liberation. Sound, motion, and madness rolled into one. When the stroke robbed him of mobility, it also robbed audiences of that voice in full flight. But in another sense, it revealed a different kind of performance, one grounded not in flamboyance, but in quiet resilience. Curry's silence after 2012 wasn't a retreat. It was a transformation. The man who had always spoken through characters was, for once, simply himself. The first major public sign of recovery came a few years later, when he appeared, to the surprise and delight of fans, at the Actors Fund's Tim Curry Benefit Gala in 2015. Dressed sharply, with his familiar sly smile, Curry accepted a Lifetime Achievement Award. As the audience rose to their feet, the applause wasn't just for his past roles, it was for his survival. His speech was brief but heartfelt, laced with dry humor that drew laughter from the crowd. It was as if the room collectively exhaled. Tim was still Tim. The clip went viral online. Fans who hadn't seen him since before the stroke shared it with tears and pride. The man who once terrified and delighted millions had now inspired them. After that, it became clear that Curry's life would never return to what it was, but that didn't mean it was over. He began to embrace public events selectively, giving interviews, lending his voice to animated projects, and staying active in charity work. It was a different kind of stage, but one that suited him. Slower, quieter, but still full of character. The stroke had taken something, yes, but it also distilled something essential. Beneath the performances, the costumes, and the eccentric roles was a man of immense grace and humor. His tragedy became his rebirth, in many ways not in career, but in perspective. He once said in an interview years after his recovery, "I do try to look on the bright side of life." I suppose it's a bit of a cliché, but it's true. And that sentiment, understated but profound, became the guiding light of his later years. If his earlier decades were defined by the roar of applause and the flash of stage lights, his later life was defined by the quiet rhythm of gratitude. The same man who once electrified theaters now found joy in conversation, laughter, and simple human connection. The tragedy of Tim Curry's stroke wasn't the end of a career. It was the start of a very different kind of performance, one that required no spotlight, no camera, no costume, just courage, through recovery, a new routine. Recovery, for Tim Curry, was never about returning to who he was before the stroke. It was about learning to move forward within new limits and finding meaning inside them. What followed the medical emergency wasn't a dramatic montage or overnight transformation, but a steady private process of rediscovery. After his hospital stay, Curry began an intensive rehabilitation program that focused on physical therapy and speech work. Each day was built around repetition, small, precise exercises to rebuild strength and coordination. For someone who had once lived through movement and performance, the slow pace was an unfamiliar rhythm. But he adapted. Friends later described how he approached recovery like rehearsal, showing up, staying consistent, and pushing through the frustration with the same discipline he once brought to the stage. He understood that progress would come quietly, not in applause, but in inches. Curry's home became his sanctuary. It wasn't just a place to rest, but to rebuild. Therapists visited regularly, helping him regain as much independence as possible. Bit by bit, he found stability in the everyday, the quiet satisfaction of a routine, the small triumphs of movement and communication returning. Through it all, humor remained his constant companion. Curry's wit was famously sharp, and it didn't dull with hardship. Therapists and close friends have recalled how he would make light of his exercises, cracking jokes between sets, or mimicking exaggerated dramatics when frustrated. It wasn't denial, it was resilience disguised as laughter. That sense of play had always been at the heart of his art, and now it became a tool for survival. By turning recovery into something performative, even in small ways, he reclaimed control over his story. And humor had another benefit. It kept the people around him comfortable. Many who visited expected to find a man defeated. Instead, they were met with familiar charm and irreverence. The experience of being with Tim Curry remained much the same. He just happened to be sitting down. The years following the stroke passed without fanfare. Curry rarely appeared in public, not out of bitterness, but preference. He valued privacy and chose to recover away from the noise of speculation. Those who knew him say that he never sought pity. He continued to live independently in Los Angeles, surrounding himself with books, music, and close friends. His voice, though changed, still carried that distinctive cadence, smooth, deliberate, mischievous. He gave few interviews, but when he did, his composure and humor reminded audiences that his identity extended far beyond physical ability. When asked once about how he was coping, he simply said, "I'm doing well and feeling fine." It was a brief statement, but revealing, calm, measured, quietly optimistic. Reconnecting with the world. Eventually, he began to reappear in small but significant ways. The 2015 Actors Fund tribute marked his return to public life, and after that, he accepted select invitations that allowed him to connect with fans without straining himself physically. He appeared at comic conventions, usually via virtual panels or seated interviews, where he spoke warmly about his career. Fans noticed that while his movements were limited, his wit was as quick as ever. The banter flowed naturally, self-deprecating, dry, intelligent. These appearances meant more than nostalgia. For longtime admirers, seeing Curry again, alive, articulate, and engaged, was reassurance. He had endured something devastating, but he hadn't disappeared. His resilience became part of his legacy. Although performing on stage was no longer possible, Curry continued to work through his voice, the one gift time and circumstance couldn't completely take. Voice acting offered flexibility, and he used it to stay creatively active. He reprised beloved roles for audio projects, participated in animated features, and lent his unmistakable tone to narration work. In each recording, that playful intelligence and velvet menace remained. His voice had matured, deepened by experience, but it still carried that unmistakable blend of mischief and authority. For Curry, this wasn't merely work, it was continuity. It proved that art could adapt, that creation didn't require perfection, only persistence. Outside of work, Curry maintained a quiet but full life. Friends spoke of his love for conversation, for art and music, for discussing theater and film with the same enthusiasm as ever. Though his world had narrowed physically, it had deepened emotionally. He found joy in the slower moments, sharing meals, listening to jazz, keeping up with correspondence from fans. He had always been private, but never withdrawn. Even after everything, he remained open, kind, and curious about the world. That curiosity, the artist's instinct to keep observing, never left him. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger as the noise of fame receded. What impressed many was not just that Curry survived, but how he carried himself afterward. He never spoke at length about the stroke, never invited sympathy. Instead, when asked, he shifted focus back to his career, his colleagues, or the projects he loved. It was a subtle lesson in dignity that one's worth doesn't diminish with circumstance. He let his composure do the talking. When he accepted the Lifetime Achievement Award, his brief comments captured that spirit perfectly. He thanked his peers, offered a wry remark, and smiled through the applause. There was no self-pity, only gratitude. Tim Curry's recovery was not marked by grand public gestures or dramatic reinvention. It was quiet, disciplined, deeply personal, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. In a culture obsessed with comebacks and transformation stories, his approach felt refreshingly human. He didn't try to rewrite what had happened, he simply lived with it, gracefully. And perhaps that's why his story resonates so strongly. The tragedy of the stroke could have defined him. Instead, he allowed it to become just one part of a much larger narrative, one that continues to unfold even now. By the time he reconnected with his audience, something had shifted, not just in his health, but in how people saw him. The shock of his illness had faded, replaced by a renewed appreciation for his artistry. To understand the depth of that legacy, it's worth looking back at the years before the tragedy, at the career that built his legend, and the roles that made Tim Curry an icon of stage and screen. Life, career, and impact. Before the stroke, before the years of quiet resilience, Tim Curry had already built one of the most unique and eclectic careers in modern entertainment. His story isn't just that of an actor who became famous, it's the story of a performer who refused to be ordinary. Every role he took carried that unmistakable mix of theatrical flair, intelligence, and danger. To understand his legacy, you have to go back to where that spark began. Timothy James Curry was born on April 19, 1946, in the small English village of Grappenhall, Cheshire. His father worked for the Royal Navy. His mother was a school secretary, and their modest life didn't predict a future of stardom. But music ran through his childhood. He sang in church choirs and local performances, showing early on that he had both discipline and a natural ear for rhythm. When his father died young, Curry was still in his teens, a loss that shaped his self-reliance and inner drive. He later studied English and drama at the University of Birmingham, where he developed a fascination with language, rhythm, and storytelling. Acting wasn't just expression for him, it was precision. Every pause, every inflection, was deliberate. After graduation, he joined the vibrant London theatre scene. The late 60s were an era of experimentation. Theatre was bold, irreverent, and political. Curry's talent fit right in. His early roles in productions like Hair gave him a taste of fame, but more importantly, they revealed what kind of performer he was: magnetic, versatile, afraid of strangeness. It wasn't long before that fearlessness brought him his defining opportunity. In 1973, Curry was cast as Dr. Frank Furter in the Rocky Horror Show, a small London stage production that blurred the lines between comedy, horror, and glam rock. At first, no one expected it to last. It was outrageous, filled with sexual innuendo, and gleefully mocked conventional norms. But Curry's performance changed everything. His Frank Furter was electric, flamboyant but grounded, bizarre yet magnetic. He wasn't just playing a character, he was commanding the audience, seducing them into his world. When the Rocky Horror Picture Show was adapted into a film in 1975, Curry took his performance to new heights. The movie initially flopped in mainstream cinemas, but midnight screenings turned it into a phenomenon. Audiences dressed up, sang along, shouted at the screen, and Curry became an icon of counterculture. To this day, his portrayal remains one of the most memorable in film history, a fearless blend of humor, sexuality, and showmanship. He embodied freedom in a time that still feared it. For many, Frankenfurter was more than a character. He was a symbol of self-expression. Range without boundaries. After Rocky Horror, Curry could have easily become typecast as the eccentric villain or the flamboyant outsider. Instead, he proved that he could do everything: comedy, drama, horror, even musical theater. His filmography through the 80s and 90s reads like a study in range. In Clue, 1985, he played Wadsworth, the fast-talking butler whose manic energy carried the entire film. The role demanded razor-sharp timing, and Curry delivered a performance that was equal parts hilarious and technically brilliant. In Ridley Scott's Legend, also 1985, he transformed into the Lord of Darkness, an otherworldly creature buried under layers of prosthetics. The performance was nearly unrecognizable, but the voice gave him away. Even hidden behind horns and red makeup, Curry's charisma radiated through. Then came It, 1990, the television adaptation of Stephen King's novel. His portrayal of Pennywise the Clown terrified a generation. Unlike later versions of the character, Curry's Pennywise was both funny and horrifying, switching between the two in an instant. That unpredictability made him unforgettable. For many actors, these would have been career-defining roles. For Curry, they were simply chapters. He moved easily between film, television, and theater, never staying in one genre long enough to be trapped by it. Even as his live-action performances captured audiences, Curry's voice took on a life of its own. Deep, rich, and endlessly expressive, it became one of the most recognizable in entertainment. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, he became a staple in animation and video games, from Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest, to The Wild Thornberrys, from Duckman to Rugrats. He played villains, mentors, and narrators with equal finesse, his tone shifting effortlessly between menace and warmth. Voice work offered him something he loved: the ability to inhabit wildly different worlds without the physical constraints of film. Even after his stroke, this became the creative space he could return to. The microphone, after all, still belonged to him. Long before Hollywood, Curry dreamed of being a singer. His musical career may not have eclipsed his acting, but it reflected the same theatrical energy. In the late 70s and early 80s, he released 3 solo albums: Read My Lips, Fearless, and Simplicity. blending rock, jazz, and cabaret influences. His voice on those records was lush and confident, marked by the same playful defiance he brought to his characters. Critics may have been divided, but listeners who discovered his music often describe it as timeless, a glimpse into the soul of a performer who could never sit still in one medium. Music remained important throughout his life. Even during recovery, he was known to listen to jazz and sing quietly to himself. For Tim Curry, performance was never just a job. It was the way he breathed. The person behind the performances. Despite the extravagance of his characters, Curry himself was reserved. He never courted fame in the typical Hollywood sense. He rarely discussed his private life and seemed happiest among close friends, musicians, and stage colleagues. He never married and had no children, but he cultivated deep, lasting relationships. Co-stars consistently describe him as generous, quick-witted, and deeply professional. Someone who made sets lighter simply by being there. There was also a certain English restraint about him. Beneath the humor was humility. He didn't chase celebrity, he chased good work. That attitude gave his career longevity and earned him respect across industries. The mark Tim Curry left on pop culture is almost impossible to measure. For many, he represents the spirit of fearless creativity, a performer who made weirdness glamorous and intellect magnetic. The Rocky Horror Picture Show remains a phenomenon decades later, screened in theaters worldwide. Curry's Frank-N-Furter continues to inspire artists, drag performers, and anyone who's ever felt out of place. The role became a touchstone for gender expression and artistic freedom long before such ideas were mainstream. You can also see Curry's influence in how later generations of actors approach character work. The willingness to take risks, to blend comedy and darkness, to give villains heart and heroes quirks. In animation, his vocal imprint endures. Echoes of his tone appear in characters across genres, from fantasy to children's shows. And among fans, his career remains a blueprint for authenticity. He didn't follow trends, he followed curiosity. As time passed, Curry's work slowed, but his connection to audiences didn't. He appeared in voice roles and occasional interviews, still radiating the same dry charm. At fan conventions, his interactions were brief but genuine. A handshake, a smile, a quip that reminded everyone he was still the same artist underneath. He continued to live in Los Angeles, surrounded by books, music, and art. Those who've met him in recent years describe him as content, reflective, but not nostalgic, aware of his impact, yet humble about it. There's a kind of poetic symmetry in that. After a life of performing bold, larger-than-life characters, Tim Curry has settled into something quieter, more grounded. His art has already spoken for him. He no longer needs to. Ultimately, Curry's story isn't just about the roles he played, but the permission he gave audiences to embrace complexity. He showed that being theatrical didn't mean being false, that emotion, humor, and eccentricity could all coexist in a single human being. For queer audiences, Rocky Horror was revolutionary. For young performers, his range was aspirational. For fans of cinema, he represented a kind of rare creative courage, the ability to go all in, to make the strange feel profound. Even now, years after his stroke, his name evokes instant warmth. People smile when they talk about him. They quote his lines, imitate his voice, replay his scenes. That kind of legacy isn't built by fame alone. It's built by authenticity. Tim Curry didn't just entertain, he liberated. Today, his appearances are rare, his interviews brief, but his presence never really left. The man who once filled theaters with wild energy now moves audiences in quieter ways. His resilience, artistry, and grace have merged into something timeless, a living testament to endurance. But perhaps what makes his story most powerful is what it says about art itself, that it can outlast the body, that the work of a lifetime can continue to speak long after the curtain falls. The heart behind the stage. Perhaps the most revealing measure of Tim Curry's success lies in how he used his influence. Though he rarely spoke about it publicly, Curry was deeply involved in philanthropic work, particularly supporting causes tied to health, performance, and education. After his stroke, he became an informal advocate for stroke awareness and rehabilitation, using his own recovery story to inspire others facing similar challenges. He participated in benefit events for hospitals and medical research organizations, often lending his presence or his voice to fundraising campaigns rather than making grand public statements. His connection to the Actors Fund, an organization dedicated to helping performers in need, remained one of the constants in his later life. He appeared at their virtual galas, donated proceeds from signed memorabilia, and quietly supported initiatives for struggling stage actors and crew members. Friends and associates recall that his generosity was quiet, never performative. He preferred direct help, writing checks, mentoring younger actors, or encouraging colleagues who faced illness or burnout. To those who knew him, his empathy came naturally. Fame never insulated him from humanity. Curry also extended his compassion to children's charities, particularly those tied to arts education. He believed creativity should be accessible to everyone, not just those with resources. His own beginnings, a small-town boy with a choir voice and big dreams, likely shaped that conviction. Even after his health crisis, Curry's humor and kindness made him a beloved figure in the artistic community. When he appeared at benefit events, it was often less about recognition and more about solidarity. He understood what the performing arts demanded: the instability, the passion, the uncertainty, and he gave back to that world quietly, consistently. If you were moved by Tim Curry's story, don't forget to click subscribe for more untold stories behind the stars who shaped our screens.